Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this beautiful river room at King's College London, overlooking, as you'll see when we open up the blinds later, the Thames, which is of course a river that is sacred to many Britons. I'd like to extend a warm London welcome, in particular to our distinguished speaker, June Oscar, about whom more in a moment. I call it a warm London greeting. That's for the welcome, not so much for London, particularly if you've come from 38 degrees, as I know June has. Just to let you know the procedure for tonight, June will give her lecture, and then we'll move straight into drinks and canapes in this same room. And during that time, June would very much welcome any discussion points or questions from you if you'd like to approach her. My name is Ian Henderson, and I'm the Director of the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies here at King's College London. It's a great honour for the centre that June agreed to speak for us, and we've been delighted to support her visit to London. The Menzies Centre has promoted teaching and research about Australia here in London for over 30 years. We introduce Australian subjects to hundreds of first-year students, bringing scores further on to more specialised studies of Australian history, literature, cinema and politics, right up to doctoral level. In all of this, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture and politics have a central place. We see this introduction of British students to the extraordinary achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the past and in the present as a form of advocacy for Indigenous rights. As our turnout tonight suggests, there is an enormous interest in Indigenous affairs in London, but also a great need to give the approach to Indigenous knowledges and experiences their due as complex ways of knowing that cannot simply be understood or owned by anyone, particularly those like myself who are outside kin, as it were. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have been trying to teach others for centuries, and the task we instill in our research, communications and teaching at the Menzies Centre is first and foremost to stop and to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, London is listening, as demonstrated by the tremendous critical success of the BP exhibition Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilization and the popularity it will undoubtedly assume over the coming months. The exhibition is also supported by the Menzies Centre, and I note we will be co-hosting this Friday a panel discussion at the museum on the art of country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art today. May I briefly plug one other event, a screening of Mabo, Life of an Island Man, followed by a Q&A with Director Trevor Graham. This will take place on the evening of Tuesday, the 26th of May here at King's, and is led by my colleague, Dr. Peter Kilroy, who is researching Torres Strait Islander documentary film as part of the British Academy project. But that's enough blather from me. We're here to listen to far more important words. June Oscar is the Chief Executive Officer of the Mananwantakura Fitzroy Women's Resource Centre and a proud Bunuba woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing. She is a champion for Indigenous Australian languages, social justice, women's issues, and research into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. In 2011, she was named one of the 50 most influential women in the world for her work in improving the lives of those living in remote Aboriginal communities. She is co-founder of the Yiramalay Wesley Studio School, and in 2012 was appointed as an ambassador by the Western Australian Commissioner for Children and Young People. In 2013, she was awarded an Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthday Honours. In 2014, she was granted the Menzies School of Health Research Medallion for her work with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. In 2015, King's College London is greatly honoured to be hosting her lecture this evening, which is entitled Encountering Truth, the Real-Life Stories of Objects from Empire's Frontier and Beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming June Oscar.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I wish to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives and other First Nations peoples present here tonight. I would like to thank the Menzies Centre at King's College for making this trip possible and inviting me to give this lecture. I also wish to acknowledge and thank the British Museum for their support in assisting me with this visit. It is important that also I acknowledge the Australian Institute for Torres Strait Islander, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Russ Taylor, it's great that you're here, and I, as a former council member, recognise the important role of IATSIS in keeping our stories and an important keeping place of our materials back home. Distinguished guests, colleagues, to friends and families and supporters, thank you all for coming tonight. To our young people at home and here tonight, to Samuel, Josh and Manny, our futures. Jalonguru manangara, palangara. Ulaonga ngara dangana Bunuba. Mada ulinyaga dangana ngaragananga jandu yana. Nganya birme birango jurala. Marngara wadbereganya yarangya moy. Nganda yedangana purri lingara kurikara yananga. Polba ngaraga yananga British Museum yo apagaoraga. Marngara inga uruga uraga. Yaranganga moy. Nganda jio kamale ya moy. Ngadajiana polba, ingi berango bagar, Bunuba ngara dangane. Londo, rarga, pelga, purudi wara waraga, baga waraga, yaranga yoa, Bunuba ngara dangane. Bunuba yoa moy. Ngadiana polba, baga waraga, nyana yoa dangane. Pagawai, Papa Abri, Peluga, Yolngarao, Ngai Walangalairi. I said in my language, Bunuba, to you, good evening. This is my language, Bunuba. I will share with you stories from my people and what happened to them when white men came to our lands. We still remember this story. There are materials from my people at the British Museum. White men took these from our land, brought them to a foreign place. These materials have names in our languages. The trees, stones, grasses, they still grow and they still stand on our land. We know these places. We visit them often. We still make materials from those very same trees. These materials in the British Museum sit in a bigger story. They sit at the centre of that big story. They sit there forever. We will never forget this story. What you have seen in that sweeping panorama and what you have heard in the ancient words I have spoken are greetings from my people, the Bunuba. We live in the far north, west of Western Australia, in an arid and subtropical region known as the Kimberley. We, the Bunuba, are one of hundreds of different Aboriginal language groups living across the varied terrains of a landmass which since British colonisation has come to be known as the nation-state of Australia. For those of you in the audience who have been or know Australia, you will have a sense of the vastness of its landscape. To give everyone else a full appreciation of just how great and diverse this continent is and how many Aboriginal countries traverse its space, Australia is 50% greater in size than Europe and 32 times greater than the United Kingdom. My Bunuba homelands are the same distance from Sydney and the homelands of the Eora peoples as it is from here, London to Moscow. So we've all travelled a long way to be here tonight. Aboriginal people use the term country to define how these immense terrains and interconnecting ecosystems, from the tropical salt waters in the north to the rolling desert sandhills and fertile river floodplains, belonging to culturally and societally distinctive yet connected Aboriginal nations, each with its own languages. The languages of our countries, like Bunuba, speaks to the intimate attachment we have to the land and the deep knowledge of these unique habitats that we carry with us from one generation to the next, since a time immemorial. Or in a Western measurement of time, we have been living on our countries with our ancestors for over 60,000 years. As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, we are the first peoples of the oldest, continuous living and enduring civilization on earth. Wow. Still, coming from a civilization with a historical track record that is unbeaten the world over, I have had a yearning to visit your country, not just to prove that the time has come for the empire to strike back, but because this place has its own rich and diverse history in its own right, and by some remarkable feat of exploration and empire building over recent times, your country has become entwined with ours and shaped so many of our contemporary ways of being. Tonight, I am honoured to speak at such an esteemed academic institution. So close to the flowing waters of the Thames, the gateway to the murky ocean road that set in motion a course of events that saw our distant worlds collide and in many respects unite. Over the last 2 days, I've had the pleasure of exploring this area within the city of Westminster. I've wanted to gain a sense of how 2 centuries ago this capital was able to transplant its entire governmental and judiciary system to the other side of our planet. 1778 marks the first time in human history that colonisation took place at such a great distance from the home shores of the coloniser, 9,420 miles away to be precise. Aboriginal people use our land as a plane of spatial and temporal navigation. Our earth is imbued with the voices of our ancestors. Their lessons from across time and space help to situate us in the present. I have found that this cityscape is just as full of ancestral voices as my own Bunuba country. I walked from here through Whitehall, past military buildings and memorials, government departments and ministerial headquarters, into Westminster, the seat of British government. I saw the new building of Scotland Yard, your beacon of central law enforcement and surveillance. I watched Big Ben chime, its ticking arms keeping a watchful order. I leant on the walls of the embankment and saw the heaving flow of people going about their daily working lives either side of the Thames. And then behind where we are now, I wandered into the Royal Courts of Justice, a grand statement to the judgment of ruling overseers. This place remains an outstanding testament to London's web of imperial power. No wonder the most expansive empire ever created and known to humankind was conceived here. So we are in a perfect location to set the scene in telling my story tonight. It is also a great opportunity to be here on the eve of the launch of the groundbreaking British Museum exhibition, Indigenous Australia, Enduring Civilization. The exhibition is an extraordinary move on behalf of the British Museum because unbelievably and significantly, it is the first time in the United Kingdom that an exhibition of its scale has been devoted wholly to the history and culture of Indigenous Australians, both Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders. 7 years in the making, a collaborative effort between the British Museum and the National Museum of Australia. It has all been overseen and guided by a skillful and talented team of people. I acknowledge all of you. I want to acknowledge especially two of its members sitting in the audience tonight. Mr. Peter Yu, a Yawuru man from the Kimberley, who also shares my Bunuba heritage, a great friend, working ally, an inspiring political advocate for Indigenous rights, who's played an important and prominent mentoring role in my life, and from Ludruita, Miss Gay Sculthorpe, a Palawakani woman from northeast Tasmania, curator and section head of Oceania, Department of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum, a woman whom I respect and greatly admire. We know that each object displayed in the exhibition, dug up from the depths of both British and Australian museum collections, has conjured a range of contradictory emotions for Indigenous people across Australia. Joy and wonderment at our remarkable living cultural heritage, and pain, outrage and resentment emanating from the colonial wars, never fully acknowledged by the Australian state. Wars that saw countless violent deaths, causing profound cultural and societal loss and intergenerational grief. I know these emotions firsthand. I have been part of this exhaustive and meaningful journey every step of its way. Needless to say, Whenever an institution dares to step beyond the norm, controversy surrounds it. Still, tomorrow, in one of the most eminent institutions in the world, objects that are so precious to defining who we are as peoples will be unveiled to speak the truth of our long existence as flourishing societies and enduring ones at that. The objects at the British Museum represents survival, resilience, and productive dynamism born from the meeting point of our Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultural realities. They provide an insight into complex relations forged in first encounter frontier societies. It is a breathtaking display of Indigenous recognition, and I encourage you all to visit, and it provides perfectly the props to bring my narrative alive. There is no better place to open this exhibit than in the throbbing heart of London, where it all began. A vibrant place, a boiling pot of languages, mixed heritages, and national fusions. London can boldly hold claim to being the most multicultural cityscape on earth. This cultural wealth is the strange and wonderful repercussions of Britain's empire, greedy to consume the worlds of others. Still, in colonisation's hunger to extract wealth, the lands of others were dominated. In too many instances, colonisation has driven conflict and destruction. It has forced societies just like mine to the brink of eradication. Whether this was the intention or not, it is the truth of what happened. My Bunuba ancestors were not engulfed by the tidal wave of first British settlement. Instead, we felt the violent wash of frontier wars in the late 19th century. When I was standing on the Thames embankment yesterday, I imagined the ports with ships preparing to journey for Australia, their maiden voyage, the genesis of my future identity, when I would no longer be wholly Bunuba or collectively Aboriginal, but also an Australian. My heritage was tied to yours the day ships set sail with a cargo of chained human beings. Between 1788 and 1870, 160,000 English and Irish men, women, and children were transported to an island prison. No other society in the history of humanity has forcibly transported so many of its own subjects to a distant colony. I've learnt in the last few days that these people, our shared national ancestors, probably came from where I'm staying now, from the squalid, overcrowded streets of an 18th century Covent Garden and Holborn. Just like rapidly growing urban centres today, London's population boomed and the byproduct was poverty. Inequality is dangerous. It breeds fear and anger between the materially prosperous and powerful and the poor and marginalised. The result, the first displaced populations of Australia were condemned for the crimes of the impoverished, fighting for survival. When this population was released from the shackles of the Crown, I imagine they advanced with trepidation and determination to conquer and prosper. They pronounced Australia terra nullius, so they could own what had always been denied: land. To them, we were the flora and fauna ripe for domination. Australia has many foundation myths, but the truth of our origins remains submerged in the shallow waters of our national heritage. Within this forgotten history, the bloody battles of our nation's federation continue to go untold. By the time the unrelenting flow of settlers hit our countries in the far north, the continent was well on its way to being federated, the Australian nation-state, in 1901. The entire Aboriginal population had almost been reduced to a tenth of its size, while the new settlers swelled to a population of 3 million. Still, when white people set foot on the rocky, crevassed limestone ranges of Bunuba country, Australia was yet to be formally named as a nation. It remained 6 British colonies under the law-making power of the British Parliament, sitting in Westminster just down the road. There is a story we tell in my country which epitomises this period of history for us today. In continuing to tell the strength and resilience of the Bunuba, we tell the story of courageous defiance personified in one extraordinary man, a Bunuba man who straddled the world of the coloniser and our traditional life. The white people call this fast-fleeting trickster pigeon. This same man we know as our rebellious warrior, a spiritually powerful fighter, Jandamarra. He has become the central figure in defining our resistance. What I will show you now is one of the many present-day incarnations of Jandamarra. What will play before you is a performance that saw Jandamarra return to the Kimberley in 2011. You have the majesty of Buckingham Palace, and we have the majestic blood-red walls of Bundalngan, Winjana Gorge, where Jandamarra and his people fought the largest single violent battle in Western Australian history. At the base of one of Bundalngan's fortress-like cliff faces, Bunuba people today performed Jandamarra back into life. Our language sung, echoing across the country and reawakening our ancestors in a play created and presented by our company, Bunuba Cultural Enterprises.
Get up, Georgie. Get up inside. You tell them, station managers, police mob, all it. We got back our country now. Any white fellow we see in La Bunuba country, we gotta kill him.
Jandamarra finally accepted his power, his spirit, his ability.
Oh, well, we got there. What you have just seen is the briefest of insights into a man whose short adult life was a product of the cultural fractures, frictions and fusions of the frontier. Jandamarra represents a people on the precipice of a new world order. His actions were those of many at the time. He was born just before the Malngare, as we call white man, first came to our country. As a child, he lived both with his country's people and on the newly established sheep runs. He learnt the ways of the Malngare, speaking English, riding horses, shooting guns. As a young man, he became a tracker for the imported Colonial police force, Aboriginal police tracker. This new form of law and order was overseen by a sub-inspector, Harry Ord. He wrote in his journal 120 years ago, "I had been stationed in the far northwest on the arduous and unpleasant duty of arresting or dispersing the blacks out back from Derby, who were responsible for a number of murders of white men who were opening up new country." Dispersal are the euphemisms hiding the death toll of the time. Before white occupation in the 1880s and 1890s, our fertile country supported a population of up to 3,000 people, possibly more. The carnage that accompanied the invasion devastated the Bunuba population. In 1934, an anthropologist calculated the number of Bunuba people living on their country was 309 people. This wasn't just a police force subjugating a rebellion. This was a colonial power that through ruthless tactics and co-option were attempting to abolish and overthrow our civilization. And for a time, Jandamarra was one of the co-opted. He tracked and captured his kin, his family and countrymen, cousins, uncles and elders. With his help, the police almost brought the Bunuba to their knees. But then, in the face of overwhelming domination, where Jandamarra himself had decided to accept the ways of the Malngare alongside his traditional life, Jandamarra, in one decisive act, rejected the onslaught of white society. Jandamarra did not just join the rebellion, he galvanized the dissipated energy of his people, pulled them together and mounted a resurgence. For 3 years, the Bunuba fought a tactical guerrilla war designed to hold their country. As the Bunuba swiftly leapt between limestone ridges and through hidden tunnels, they eluded and mystified the police. The white men in their chase stumbled at every rocky outcrop, their boots and hands sliced and shredded by serrated rock edges as sharp as knives. This was the nature of the country that had kept the Western world at bay for so long. Then on the 1st of April 1897, Sub-Inspector Ord had his way. In the darkness of a tunnelled creek, Jandamarra was shot dead. His head was cut off as a sign to the new settlers that the Bunuba resistance had been destroyed. This brave warrior was just 24. 4 years later, Australia was federated. The British had sanctioned a new civilization in their distant colonies. As you all know, the story didn't end there because you have Bunuba people here today. This history teaches us that no matter how much we lost during what is widely referred to in the Kimberley as the killing times, we were not defeated. When a stand is made that was as strong as the Bunuba, it is never final. Their call for justice, freedom, and equality sings out across time. A year before he died, Jandamarra stood on a limestone cliff top looking down at the police. With his rifle held high, he declared, "This is Bunuba country." This call was heard again only recently in the Sydney Opera House, when the cantata Jandamarra, Sing for the Country, was performed. In the great concert hall, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and hundreds of children from the Gondwana choirs joined artistic forces to voice the unending sentiments of my Bunuba people. And I'll invite you all to listen, hoping we can get it coming on. Okay, just to keep us all awake. And the cantata was performed in honour of three great Australians, two senior Bunuba elders, and the late Hazel Hawke. My people are doing everything in their power to ensure that the greater meaning of Jandamarra's name will live on. In telling this history, we can see from convict times to this very moment our nations existing across the continents and oceans remain entwined. To emphasise what I mean and why the British Museum's exhibit is so profound, let me finish by explaining my close attachment to this story. It was one of my grandfathers, Grandfather Wiranmarra, who was the custodian of the Jandamarra story. His father stood with Jandamarra and others in the final battle. Grandfather Wiranmarra's father hid out in the ranges after Jandamarra was killed. Grandfather Wiranmarra was a survivor of the frontier wars. because he was taken to live with a white family on their cattle station on our traditional lands. As he grew, it was this white family, named the Blythes, who told Grandfather Wirranmara the story of Pigeon. In the strange dynamics of the frontier, they were also heavily involved in the pursuit of Jandamarra. Grandfather Wirranmara enlisted me as a young woman to help reawaken this story within the spirit of our nation. He believed that as foundational history, it would help us move toward reconciliation and away from conflict. So for the past 30 years, the quest to take Jandamarra to the world has been a big part of my life and of Peter's, and it will remain so for a long time to come. I have worked tirelessly alongside both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, all who have been enraptured by this history, to understand through Jandamarra what happened at first encounters, so as to establish a true sense of the settlement of the Kimberley. That Sub-Inspector Ord, who I mentioned, managed the police brigade against the Bunuba, who also wrote in his description of dispersing the blacks that he had accumulated, and I quote, a quantity of native weapons and thought they might be of value and interest to the museum. The weapons are genuine native weapons of the type taken by the police from native camps, end quote. I feel great angst as I speak these lines. I can easily imagine my great-grandmother dropping her Kulaman, her Yamada, as the police raided and ravaged her world. She could have been carrying her daughter, my granny, in that Kulaman, or winnowing seeds. These props of my narrative, my family's living history, are amongst the objects held at the British Museum. Even Jandamarra's boomerang is on display. Ord shipped these items to Britain as the artefacts of a dying race overcome by progress and modernisation. This was the popular belief of the time. For him, they were soon to be historical relics of a civilization that was ending due to the domination of another. Jandamarra's ancestral voice, penetrating our present, reminds us that this is not the case. His life has reinforced our history, ensuring that these objects remain animated. However, as proof to the lasting power of empire, these objects that are us reside here. Even the head of Jandamarra is somewhere in this land. I know this because the living grandson of the Blythes, Grandfather Wirranmara's step-family, has told us that through various police relations and arms trading networks at the time of Federation, Jandamarra's head was gifted to the Greener family. The Greeners were one of the largest gun manufacturers of the empire. Their factory was based in Birmingham, and their guns travelled the world, known for their lethal force and dependability when it came to triggering the fatal shot. The memory of Jandamarra's skull sitting in the factory's private museum, has been confirmed in the oral testaments of ex-employees. He was displayed as a trophy, a symbol of conquest, where the production of guns marked the final frontier for the warriors resisting empire. Little did those triumphant colonizers know that Jandamarra is a magic man, a Jalgangoro. His voice is still being heard, even without his head. Jandamarra resonates with us today. He is almost tangible because he is teaching lessons which are yet to be learnt. As Aboriginal people, we view the world as cyclical. The concept of knowledge, of knowledgeable voices existing long after death, is fundamental to our societal existence. Everything on our country carries the voices of our ancestors. The coolamans, spears and boomerangs, the trees, animals and water sites. We know how to make tools, what to hunt and when to survive in difficult terrains because we walk in the footsteps of our ancestors. If we were to ignore our ancestral past, we would lose precious knowledge, and the consequences would be devastating. Just like Jandamarra grew up across cultural divides, the lessons that we all must learn from this story are singing out from our shared ancestry. The same framework of authority that came to rule our world at Federation, imposed with absolute disregard for our societal worth, remains in place today. No wonder our present displays disturbing parallels to the time of the frontier wars. You may have heard of our current government's pronouncement of the forced closure of Aboriginal communities. Many of those communities surround the country that Jandamarra defended from colonial occupation. Of course, Jandamarra's story must continue to be told when we must continue to deal with a government making decisions for our future without us. A government that would prefer to repeat the trauma of our dislocation than to sit and negotiate with us, to allow us an equal voice in planning for the future of our nation together. Time and again, when governments make non-negotiated and exclusionary decisions, it is our humanity that they forsake. They justify their authoritative determining power with economic pragmatics and political necessities. They did this when they created a convict class, when they federated a nation on the lie of terra nullius, and they continue to do this when they determine that Aboriginal people living on their country is an unsustainable financial burden. It does not have to be like this. We can learn to coexist. Jandamarra began his life with white people by adopting their practices because he saw in them a great worth. But he gave them up, knowing the incredible value of his own society. He would not sacrifice one for the other. Jandamarra wanted the best of both worlds, and this is still what we strive for today. In achieving this, we cannot fail to grasp the deeper meanings of Jandamarra, that we are stronger when we act together. that we make better and smarter decisions when we do it together. When we acknowledge the wonderful, complex worlds of others, we embrace our humanity. We do not forsake it. This is the journey of reconciliation. In holding Jandamarra close, we can travel this journey with his spirit of fierce resistance, rebelling against all forms of injustice, domination, and inequality. The British Museum's Enduring Civilization is a powerful step toward honouring our living history. It displays items from the story I have told tonight that tell a greater truth of Aboriginal lives then and now. Both older and present-day objects draw attention to the unsettled and emergent dialogue that is ever unfolding between our Indigenous nations' claims to self-determination and sovereignty, which we have never relinquished, and the Australian nation-state's imposed governmental and legislative authority over the entire continent. It is our triumph that in the heart of London, with the seat of government that once upon a time threatened to demolish us just down the road, that our lives and heritages have come to be displayed through our equal consent and involvement. Stories like Jandamarra prove that we can break the linear confines of history, so our lessons of justice transcend the bounds of time. Death on the frontier was not the end. If you have a chance to tour the exhibit, know that the things you are witnessing come from our shared history. Allow them to ignite your imaginations and find within them universal lessons and sentiments of how we can live more vibrant, inclusive, and humane lives. Then one day, when we have learnt from our mixed heritage and accepted our equal Indigenous and non-Indigenous nationhoods, we will be ready for these objects to be returned home, to be kept for prosperity, to exist where they rightfully belong, beside our ancestors, as a powerful inheritance for the next generation of our people. Born into a strong, proud, and remarkable civilization. Thank you.